The strangest thing about that morning was not the first-class flight confirmation Blake placed in my hand, nor the sudden trip to Las Vegas he called one last chance to save this marriage. The strangest thing of all was the way my husband kissed my cheek outside the airport, so quickly it felt like a goodbye he had rehearsed in advance. There was no smile, no look that lingered, just a cold touch and a sentence so short it sounded like an order. Text me when you get to the gate. My name is Savannah Hayes. I was 32 that year, an English teacher, and also a wife who had grown used to telling herself that her husband's silence was only exhaustion, that the distance between us would someday close. But from the moment Blake drove me to the airport that morning, I felt that something was wrong. He was too quiet, too rushed, and his hand when it touched me was cold, as if his heart had left our marriage a long time ago. Then, only a few minutes after I stepped through security, a female TSA agent suddenly came up beside me, leaned in close, and whispered, "Ma'am, don't go to that gate, come with me, right now." If this story touches something in you, stay with me until the end. And if you'd like, leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from. Sometimes intuition is the only thing that stands between us and disaster. If you connect with stories like this, gently subscribe to the channel, because what I saw through that airport glass changed my life forever. Before that morning, I would have told you I was far too careful to end up trapped in someone else's plan. I always thought I was clear-headed enough to tell who was sincere and who was only good at saying the right things at the right time. Maybe that was also why I trusted Blake so much. When I was 32, I taught English literature at a high school in Portland. From the outside, my life back then looked fairly peaceful. I had a small house with a sunny porch, a job that made me feel useful, and a marriage that had lasted 9 years, with a man who had once made me believe that peace was something you could actually hold in your hands. Blake used to be the kind of person who made others feel safe simply by walking into a room. He remembered that I liked very little sugar in my coffee, but loved pastries on rainy days. He knew when I needed silence, and when a hand resting against my back was enough. We used to have beautiful mornings, beautiful in that quiet, ordinary way no one ever believes can disappear. I graded papers at the dining table, and he stood in the kitchen making coffee, sometimes looking up to say something that made me laugh. On weekends, if the weather was nice, we drove outside the city, found a small town, an old diner, or simply wandered through a bookstore before heading home before dark. Some marriages are built on passion. Ours, at least in the early years, was built on familiarity and trust. Then my sister died. I still do not like saying that sentence directly, even now. Some losses do not move through you like a knife. They move through you like a long winter that refuses to end. After her car accident, I lived like a person walking underwater. I still went to work, still stood in front of my class, still graded essays, still smiled at the right moments for students and coworkers. But inside, I was almost completely hollow. There were days I drove to school and could not remember which road I had taken to get there. There were evenings I spread mail, bills, and paperwork across the table and could only stare at them as though they were written in a foreign language. Blake was the one who stepped into that emptiness so gently. He never pushed me to be strong. He never told me to move on the way other people did. He simply sat beside me on the couch and took hold of the parts of life I no longer had the strength to carry. "Let me handle it," he said, his voice quiet and steady. "You don't have to think about anything, Savannah. Just rest. I'm here." And I believed him. I believed him the way a drowning person clings to the only thing still floating on the surface. I signed whatever papers he put in front of me. I let him answer emails. I let him manage the accounts, the bills, the insurance, the inheritance my sister had left behind. At the time, I did not call it giving away control. I called it marriage. I called it love. When he said, "Don't worry about the money, I'll handle it," I felt grateful. When he changed the passwords on our accounts to make them safer, I felt protected. When he began telling me that some things were better if he made the decisions, I did not realize that sometimes the only difference between care and control is a voice gentle enough to hide it. Looking back, I understand that I did not fall in love with a monster from the beginning. I fell in love with a man who was very good at becoming the place of peace I needed most. And maybe that is what made it so terrifying. It was not that Blake changed too quickly. It was that he knew exactly who to become, so I would open the door, so I would hand him all of my trust, so that by the time I realized I no longer held anything in my own life anymore, everything had already gone too far. 3 days before the trip, Blake placed a thick envelope on the kitchen table just as I was making coffee. The gesture was so light that if I had not seen his hand set it down, I might have assumed it was only another bill or another document that needed my signature. "Open it," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something too smooth about it, as if the line had been prepared in advance. I slid a finger under the flap. Inside were 2 first-class tickets to Las Vegas, a confirmation for a luxury resort suite, and an itinerary arranged in such detail that I looked up at him immediately. "Blake, what is this?" He leaned back against the counter, folded his arms, and gave me a smile so carefully measured it barely felt real. A chance to start over, just the two of us. I looked down at the bold print on the plane tickets, then back at him. For months, we had been talking about money in whispers, as if speaking too loudly would make everything break for good. Blake kept saying the investments were only tied up for a while. Meanwhile, some of our utility bills had started coming late. The credit card I used least had suddenly been declined once at the bookstore, and the dishwasher had been broken for 2 months without being repaired because it wasn't the right time yet. And yet, here he was, standing in front of me as if spending money on a lavish getaway was the most natural thing in the world. "I thought we were supposed to be tightening our belts," I said softly. Blake stepped closer and rested his hand on my waist. "I found a way. I'm trying to fix us." A few years earlier, that sentence alone might have been enough to soften me. But this time, instead of feeling moved, I felt a sharp little ache in my chest. It was not fear. Not yet. Just something small and hard to name, like a thread being pulled out of place in a fabric I had always known. Over the next few days, that feeling did not go away. It grew slowly, through details so small I felt almost ashamed for suspecting my own husband because of them. Blake insisted I only bring a carry-on. "It's a short trip, no need to drag a bunch of stuff." He said it as if he were helping me, but he stood right beside me while I packed, his eyes following every item I folded into the suitcase. And when I zipped it shut, he opened it again to check. Once, then again. "What are you looking for?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Just want to make sure you didn't forget anything," he said, but his hands kept carefully going through every compartment. The following afternoon, I saw him slip a small bottle of pills into the front pocket of my suitcase. "Electrolyte tablets," he said. "Vegas is dry and hot. You get headaches." I picked up the bottle and turned it in my hand. The label was brand new, not a name I had ever used before. "Since when are you so thoughtful about vitamins?" I asked with a half-joking smile. Blake smiled too, but his eyes did not. "Since I had to learn to pay attention to the things you always forget." He started taking more calls than usual. Every time his phone rang, he stepped out into the garage or onto the back porch. Once, I was standing in the hallway and heard his voice drift back toward me. Not loud, just enough for broken pieces of a sentence to reach where I stood. "She'll be there." A pause, then, no delays. And after that, even lower, almost lost beneath the wind through the doorframe. "Just make sure it looks natural." I stood frozen for a moment. When Blake came back inside, I was still there. He looked at me and hesitated ever so slightly. "Who was that?" I asked. He shrugged and walked past me to get a glass of water. "Old work stuff, nothing important." Then, as if remembering he needed one more layer of normalcy, he turned and kissed my forehead. "You're overthinking." But the next morning, as I passed the dining table, I saw his laptop half open. On the screen was a form with the bold heading, "Primary Beneficiary." I had not even had time to read more before Blake appeared out of nowhere and slammed the laptop shut so hard it made me jump. "Do you need something?" he asked, his voice light but too fast. "No," I said. "I was just getting a cup of coffee." That night, I walked into the kitchen and saw my wedding ring lying on the counter next to the plane tickets. I picked it up. "Why is my ring here?" Blake was standing at the sink, and he did not turn around immediately. You forgot it when you were packing. I looked down at my hand. I knew I had not forgotten it. And in that exact moment, for the first time, I felt that Blake was not arranging a trip. He was quietly arranging for my absence to look neat, believable, and free of anything messy left behind. That morning, Portland had not fully woken up yet. The sky was gray, the streets still damp from rain during the night, and everything outside the car windows looked slightly blurred, like a painting that had been pulled out of line. Blake drove faster than he needed to, both hands tight on the wheel, eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror as if someone might be following us. I sat in the passenger seat with my purse on my lap, watching the side of his face in the weak morning light, trying to convince myself that this was only stress, only a clumsy man trying to do something romantic after too many months of coldness. Only me being tired, thinking too much, letting my own anxiety distort everything. I tried making conversation a few times. I forgot to ask, "What time can we check in when we get there?" Blake answered without looking at me. "I emailed it to you." A little later I asked, "You're really not coming with me?" He exhaled, his eyes still on the road. "I already told you. I'll finish one more thing and fly in after." Every one of his answers was short, landing between us like small stones, enough to chill the water a little more each time. My phone buzzed just as we merged onto the freeway. A text from Olivia Bennett appeared on the screen. "You sure about this trip?" I stared at that line longer than necessary. Olivia was not the kind of person who interfered in a friend's marriage unless she truly sensed something worth worrying about. I had just started to hit call when Blake suddenly reached over and took the phone from my hand, so quickly it left me stunned. He set it down in the center console, his voice low but sharp. "You can call her after you land." I turned and looked at him. "Blake, that's my phone." "I know." His tone stayed completely even. "I just don't want you starting this trip with negative conversations." Something in the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Not the words themselves, the casualness. The man sitting beside me no longer looked like the one who used to remember my haircut appointments, or the one who once turned the car around just to buy the face cream I liked when the store had run out. He looked like a man watching the clock, making sure everything stayed on schedule, as if one delay could ruin the whole plan. A few minutes later, the Bluetooth system in the car lit up. An incoming call. Blake answered immediately without looking at the screen. I turned toward the window, but I could still hear every clipped, dry, hurried fragment. "Flight's on time." A pause. "Everything is in place." My heart stumbled inside my chest. Blake stared straight ahead, his jaw locked. Then he said, this time more sharply, "I said it's handled." The second I turned toward him, he ended the call. The air inside the car froze. I could hear the sound of old rain beneath the tires, the clicking of the turn signal, and my own heartbeat pounding harder than usual. "What is in place?" I asked, trying to sound natural. Blake did not answer right away. He changed lanes past a black SUV, then finally said, "Work stuff. You don't need to worry about it." "What work stuff do you still have that I don't know about?" This time he looked at me, only for a second, but it was enough for me to see something in his eyes. Not anger. Not exactly panic either. It was the hard, sharpened look of someone who did not want to be thrown off a plan already in motion. "Savannah," he said slowly, "don't make things harder than they need to be." I stayed quiet the rest of the drive. When the car stopped at the airport drop-off zone, Blake got out, opened the trunk, took out my suitcase, and slammed the trunk shut as if he wanted to finish this part as quickly as possible. He did not offer to walk me inside. He did not ask whether I needed help. He simply slipped the strap of my bag over my shoulder, adjusted the handle of my suitcase, and gave me a gentle push forward. "Go on. You don't want to miss check-in." "You're coming in, right?" I asked. "Later," he said. "Just go ahead." Everything in the way he hurried me made me feel not like his wife, but like a task that needed to be delivered to the right place. I pulled my suitcase toward the sliding glass doors, with the uneasy feeling that something behind me was closing for good. Inside the security area, everything was bright, crowded, ordinary enough that my fear suddenly felt misplaced. I told myself, maybe I really had been thinking too much. Maybe once I got on the plane, Got a few days away from the bills, the silences, and Blake's evasive looks, things would be different. But after I passed through the checkpoint, while I was bending down to put my shoes back on, I glanced out through the glass that separated the secure area from the main terminal. And I saw Blake still standing there. He had not left. He stood off to one side, phone in hand, his face nearly expressionless, eyes fixed on me through the glass like a man who was not seeing anyone off at all, only waiting for one final confirmation. I stayed still for one extra beat, one shoe not fully on yet. And that was when I understood something very small, but cold enough to stop my heart for a moment. He was not waiting there out of love. He was making sure I didn't turn back. I was still frozen in place when a woman's voice sounded very close to my left. "Ma'am?" I turned around. A female TSA agent in her 40s, her hair in a neat bun, her face serious but not cold, was looking at me with an expression I only later understood as the look of someone who had already decided to trust her own instincts. "I'm sorry," she said more quietly, stepping closer. "Don't go toward the gate. Come with me right now." I blinked, barely processing what I had just heard. "Is something wrong with my documents?" I asked, gripping the strap of my bag tighter. "No," she answered quickly. "You are not in any trouble. But I need you to come with me." By instinct, I looked over her shoulder, back toward the glass. Blake was still there. He was on the phone, his head lowered slightly, his shoulders tense. At that exact moment, he looked up. Our eyes met across a distance that was not very far, but far enough to make my heartbeat drop inside my chest. I did not know what frightened me more, that he was still standing there, or that he did not look surprised at all to see I had not kept walking. The woman led me through a side door into a small room lit with harsh white light. It had a metal table, 2 chairs, and the smell of stale coffee mixed with paper. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but it was enough to make me start trembling. I set my bag on my lap and tried to keep my breathing steady. "Please tell me what is happening." She sat down across from me, unclipped her name tag from her jacket so it would not get in the way, and placed it on the table. "Dana Keller." She looked at me directly, without evasion, but her voice still carried the calm of someone who understood that some truths had to be spoken slowly if you did not want the other person to shatter on the spot. "You are not having a problem with your flight," she said. "But the man who just brought you here, I believe he may be the problem." I stared at her, unable to answer. "I noticed him from the moment you walked into security. He's not a passenger, but he stayed too long near the checkpoint. He kept watching you." Dana paused, giving me a moment to process her words. "I only caught fragments of a call. If she boards, it's done." Then something about Vegas. And one word that stayed with me because it felt wrong in that moment. Beneficiary. I felt the blood inside me turn colder one slow second at a time. "No," I heard myself say, very softly. "No, you must have heard wrong." Dana did not cut me off. She only leaned forward. "Can you tell me if your husband has debt? Is there insurance in your name? Is there any financial reason he would want you to disappear?" That last question hit my chest like a fist. I opened my mouth, but not enough air came in. I shook my head by reflex, then nodded, then sat there with both hands clenched so tightly together they hurt. "He manages all of our money," I finally said. I haven't looked at the accounts directly in quite a while." Dana picked up her radio and said a few short things into it. Within minutes, an airport police supervisor stepped into the room and asked her to repeat exactly what she had seen and heard. I sat there shaking, while quiet questions moved in and out of the room faster than I could follow. It was only after the preliminary checks raised multiple red flags tied to my ID, my insurance records, and my travel details that Detective Marcus Reed was called in. A short while later, a man walked into the room and introduced himself. "I'm Detective Marcus Reed." He did not force me to tell the whole story from the beginning. He only sat down and asked short, clear questions, not threatening, but each one felt like it was pulling another layer of curtain away from my eyes. "Does Blake have access to your personal accounts?" I nodded. "Are there any insurance documents you may have signed recently that you don't remember?" I thought of the laptop screen, with the words, "primary beneficiary," and the way Blake had slammed it shut too quickly. I don't know." Marcus looked directly at me. Are you sure you know where your money is? This time I could not answer at all. Everything after that happened too quickly for me to keep up. After a series of urgent calls and preliminary database checks, Marcus turned a laptop toward me. On the screen was an insurance document connected to my name, the insurance amount in the middle, and beneath it the line that made the whole room seem to tilt. Primary beneficiary Blake Hayes. Policy value $1.8 million. Marcus zoomed in on the signature. I stared at it, my eyes burning, my heart pounding against my ribs. That's not my signature, I whispered. I didn't sign that. Marcus nodded very slowly. We don't think you did. Suddenly, I could not breathe. Not in the way people cry. Not in the way a heart attack is supposed to feel. It was more like the entire world had tilted off its axis, and I was the only person in the room who did not know where to hold on. For the first time in my life, I had to look directly at a possibility that only an hour earlier I would have still called impossible. Blake was not trying to save our marriage. He was preparing to profit from my death. I do not remember how long I stared at my phone. The screen kept lighting up and going dark in my hand like a panicked heartbeat that no longer belonged to me. Blake's messages came in one after another without stopping. Where are you? Get to the gate, board now. Then again, why aren't you answering? Savannah, now. I read those lines over and over, and with every time I read them, my chest tightened more. Not one message asked if I was okay. Not one message said he was worried about me, that he was coming back to find me, that something had happened at the airport or with the flight. There was only a furious, icy urgency, as if the only thing making him panic was that I still had not done my part correctly. I set the phone down on the table, but my hand was still shaking too hard to relax. Marcus was standing by the door, speaking to someone on the phone. Dana sat in front of a computer, pulling more information on the insurance policy. The room stayed bright and sealed, quiet enough for me to hear the air conditioner humming overhead. Then another sound cut into it, a radio in the hallway, footsteps moving faster than usual. A door opening and closing. Marcus turned his head. I had not yet read anything in his expression when Dana shot up out of her chair, eyes locked on the news alert that had just appeared in the corner of her screen. "Oh my God," she said softly. I turned instinctively. A red banner was running across the screen. The flight had suffered a catastrophic incident shortly after takeoff. I did not hear the rest immediately. I only saw the shaky, blurred images of a runway, fire trucks, red and blue emergency lights flashing against the gray sky. My ears started ringing. It felt as if all the air had been pulled from the room. "No," I said, but my own voice sounded strange, thin and far away, like it belonged to someone else. "No, that can't." No one answered. I bent forward, gripping the edge of the chair with both hands. Everything inside me dropped straight into a bottomless emptiness. That flight, that gate, that seat I was supposed to have been sitting in. I thought I would start crying immediately, but my body had not even caught up enough to do that. It just froze, as if the terror was too enormous for tears to find their way out. Then the tragedy shifted into another shape, colder, more precise. Marcus got another call. He listened for a few seconds, then stepped closer to Dana. The two of them spoke very quietly, but I still caught a few words. "Gate scan. Manifest. Name confirmed." I lifted my head. "What is it?" I asked, my lips dry. No one answered right away. That frightened me more than any answer could have. Marcus pulled a chair over and sat directly across from me. His face was still calm, but something in his eyes had changed. "Savannah," he said slowly, "we just confirmed something." I looked at him without blinking. "According to the manifest, you were marked as boarded." For a few seconds, I truly did not understand. "But I didn't board." "Correct," Marcus nodded. "But the system shows that your boarding pass was scanned at the gate." I felt the blood drain out of my body. "That's impossible. My phone is still here. I never left this room." Dana turned the screen toward me. The image from the gate camera was a little blurry, but clear enough to show a person wearing a baseball cap, standing at an angle in front of the scanner holding up an electronic code. The movement was fast, just 1 second. Then the person turned away. I stared at the frame, my heartbeat painful now. "That's Blake," I whispered. No one denied it. He had saved my boarding pass in advance and flashed it at the scanner at exactly the right moment. Not long enough to draw attention, but long enough for the system to record that I had boarded. This was not some sudden accident he had simply chosen to take advantage of. Not some wild idea that had come to him that morning. Everything had been prepared in advance, step by step, neat enough, valid enough, clean enough, that on paper I could disappear without leaving a single gap behind. I sat there looking at my own name on the preliminary list, and I understood something even more horrifying than the fact that Blake wanted me dead. As far as the system was concerned, I was already beginning to disappear. If Dana had not pulled me into that room, if Marcus had not seen what was wrong, the whole world would have believed Savannah Hayes had been on that plane. And Blake would have exactly what he needed to begin claiming the insurance money, accessing the assets, and stepping into his next life as the grieving husband who had just suffered the greatest loss of his life. Marcus looked at the screen, then back at me. His voice was low but so clear that every word landed directly against my chest. He didn't just want you gone. He needed the world to believe you were gone. I do not remember whether I nodded or shook my head. I only remember what it felt like when those words hit me. It was as if one final door had opened, revealing the full, dark room I had been living beside for years. Blake was not waiting for an opportunity. He had built one. He did not just want me to disappear. He did not just want me gone. He wanted my death to make sense on paper. The next few hours passed like a fever with no sound. Federal agents arrived. Documents were sealed. My phone was taken. Marcus explained briefly that because my name was already on the list of victims, they had a very narrow window before the information spread any further. If Blake believes his plan worked, he said, he'll make a move. And when he does, we can take him with more evidence. What do I have to do? I asked. Marcus looked at me for a moment. Disappear for 72 hours. The safe house was at the edge of the city, in a neighborhood so quiet that at night you could hear the wind brushing through the trees behind the parking lot. The apartment was small, clean, almost empty except for a folding table, 2 metal chairs, a narrow couch, and 3 monitors lined up on the table. On them were images from the hidden cameras that had just been installed around my house. I sat in front of them, with a thin blanket wrapped around my shoulders, still wearing the same clothes I had worn to the airport, and watched my own home appear angle by angle, as though it no longer belonged to me, but had become the scene of a play I had never agreed to be part of. Blake came home a little before evening. I watched his car pull up, watched him step out, his tie slightly crooked, his shoulders not slumped at all. He stood on the porch for a few seconds, fit the key into the lock, and opened the door. I held my breath. In my mind there was still one very small, very foolish part of me that hoped when he walked inside, he would collapse. He would call my name. He would break something in panic. He would at least look like a man who believed he had just lost his wife. But Blake did nothing of the kind. He stood in the middle of the living room and looked around once, as if checking to see whether the house was still in order. Then he walked straight into the kitchen, opened the upper cabinet on the left, and took out the bottle of bourbon he had saved since Christmas, the year before. The one he always said he was keeping for a truly special occasion. He poured himself a glass, raised it to eye level, took a long drink, and then he smiled. It was not a broad smile, only the slightest curve at the corner of his mouth. But I knew at once what I was looking at. That was not the smile of a grieving husband trying to hold himself together. It was the smile of a man who believed the worst burden in his life had just been lifted. I turned away from the screen for a few seconds, not because I could not bear it, but because if I looked at it any longer, I thought I might throw up. Marcus was still sitting 2 chairs away from me in silence, giving me room for that final collapse of trust. When I looked back, Blake was already sitting on the couch, a glass in his hand, eyes turned toward the window, with just enough sadness in his expression that if anyone had walked in at that moment, they would have believed he was grieving. That evening, Olivia Bennett came by. I saw her car pull up in front of the house, the door flying open too quickly. And then Olivia nearly ran up to the porch. Her face was red from crying. The second Blake opened the door, she threw her arms around him, and the sound of her sobbing came through the microphone in the living room so clearly that I had to clench my hands. "Oh my God, Blake, I can't believe this. I can't." She could not finish the sentence. Blake wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin against her hair, closing his eyes with the exact posture of a man trying not to break down in front of someone else. "I can't believe it either," he said, his voice rough in all the right ways. "She was here this morning." If anyone had asked me then what betrayal sounded like, I would have said it sounded exactly like the voice of the man you once loved, performing grief in the same tone he used to soothe you to sleep. I felt sick and heartbroken at the same time. Not because of Olivia. She did not know. Her tears for me were real. That was what made it all even more unbearable. Olivia stayed almost an hour. She sat on the couch, holding Blake's hand, talking through disjointed thin things about the school, about helping notify a few of our mutual friends, about how if he needed someone with him that night, she could have her husband come over. Blake shook his head, gentle, grateful, perfectly broken in all the right places. Silent at all the right moments. He played the grieving husband so convincingly that if I had not been sitting in that cold room watching through 3 monitors, I might have believed him myself. But the second Olivia left, everything dropped off his face so fast it was terrifying. Blake locked the door, returned to the living room, sat down, and opened his laptop. The first words that appeared in the search bar made my whole body go cold. Insurance claim timeline, then death certificate processing after crash. Then estate access requirements, spouse. He typed quickly, without hesitation, like a man who had been waiting for the exact right hour to begin the next stage of his work. Not funeral arrangements, not notifying my family, not calling my friends. But procedure. Assets, access, money. Later, I watched him move through the house wearing grief like a costume. By then, I no longer needed more proof. I had seen enough. That moment killed whatever was left of my love for him. By the second night in the safe house, I thought I no longer had the strength to be hurt any further. I used to believe there was some limit to what a human being could absorb. That when too much truth hit you in too short a time, your feelings would go numb to protect whatever was left. But I was wrong. Some wounds do not arrive all at once. They come in layers, slow and precise, as if pain itself knows exactly when to go deeper. Around 11 that night, an unfamiliar car pulled up in front of the house. The porch camera trembled slightly in the yellow light, enough for me to see the car door open and a woman step out. She wore a cream-colored coat, her long hair loose around her shoulders, and there was something familiar in the way she moved. The kind of familiarity that tells you immediately. This was not her first time there. My heart tightened, not because I had not guessed it already, but because there are things you may suspect in advance that still hurt in an entirely different way once your own eyes confirm them. Blake opened the door before she even had time to knock. No question, no surprise. Just his arm opening for her, and the woman stepping inside like she belonged there. I sat up straighter. Marcus said nothing, only reached over and turned the sound higher. In the first few seconds, all I could hear was the rustle of fabric, the sound of breath being held back, and then the woman's voice came through, low, trembling, nearly breaking. "I saw the news. Oh my God, Blake." He pulled her farther inside and closed the door, his voice dropping into the same soft tone I had once heard him use with me on sleepless nights. "It's over now," he said. "We don't have to hide anymore." I did not know her name until Marcus looked down at the file that had just been brought in and said very quietly, "Camille Sutton." It took only a few minutes of listening to them speak for everything to become so clear that I no longer had any place left to lie to myself. This relationship was not some sudden mistake, not something that had begun only after our marriage had already started to crack. It had been going on for more than a year. Blake knew what kind of wine she liked. She knew where he kept the glasses. They had the easy silences of two people already deeply familiar with each other's rhythms. Then Camille placed a hand over her stomach in the most natural way, and I watched Blake bend down and touch it with gentle instinct. The entire safe house seemed to go still. "Are you sure the money will clear?" Camille asked, almost whispering. Blake laughed, a short, dry, light little laugh that might have sounded comforting if you did not know who he was. But the sentence he spoke next nearly stopped my breath. Once the payout clears, everything changes. I covered my mouth too late. The sound that broke out of me was still loud enough that Dana, who was standing near the door, turned to look at me. I did not cry immediately. I only felt my whole body turn ice cold, as if every vein inside me had suddenly been filled with freezing water. It was not only the affair or the child that shattered me, it was the calmness of that sentence, the complete absence of regret in his voice. There was no crack in the voice of a man who had already crossed too many lines to hear himself clearly anymore. He said it the way someone reads off a number that has already been calculated. And then the truth opened an even deeper door. The FBI had just received data from Blake's accounts and a set of emergency retrieved communication records. Marcus pulled a file closer, opened it for Dana, then turned the computer screen toward me. There it was, a sequence of transfers, clear dates, sums large enough that no one could explain them away as something incidental. A deposit sent to Tyler Cross, a fixer in Las Vegas, not a broker, not resort security. A man who specialized in handling problems for people with money who did not want blood on their own hands. Marcus did not soften it. The original plan was not for you to die on the plane. I looked at him, my heartbeat suddenly slow in the most terrifying way. When you got to the resort, Tyler Cross was supposed to get you alone, make you vulnerable, and make whatever happened next look accidental. I closed my eyes, but the image only became clearer. Water. Cold tile. A stranger's arms forcing me down. A death designed to look like carelessness, alcohol, a fall, a clean tragedy that would still qualify for the insurance payout. I understood immediately what that meant. The flight had never been the destination. The airport had never been where he meant to end me. It was only the first step in a journey arranged in advance, down to every point of contact. Dana turned another page. There was a call log from after the news of the crash broke. Blake had called Tyler. Just one short sentence. Stand down. She won't make it that far. So he'd been preparing my death for a very long time, while still sleeping beside me every night, still kissing my forehead before he left the house, still using that same gentle voice to ask whether I wanted more coffee in the morning. And I understood that the cruelest truth was not that Blake had stopped loving me. It was that he had been able to plan my death while still playing the role of a good enough husband that no one suspected a thing. Not even me. On the morning of the third day, Marcus walked into the safe house, holding a thin file, and wearing the face of a man who had finally gathered enough pieces to make the whole thing undeniable. He set the file on the table without speaking right away. I could see inside it the transfer records to Tyler Cross, the copy of the insurance policy with my forged signature, the access logs for my electronic boarding pass, the recordings of Blake's conversation with Camille, and even the searches about how to claim insurance money and leave the country. It was all there. Flat, cold, legal. Evidence is always much neater than the pain it represents. Marcus looked at me. It's time to finish this. I sat still for a few seconds, both hands resting on my knees. I had always thought that if that moment came, I would shake. I would be afraid. I would lose control. But what remained in me then was not panic. It felt more like a very deep stillness after someone has cried until there is nothing left. I nodded. That was all. The car carrying us turned onto my street in the late afternoon. I sat in the back seat and watched my house appear through the darkened window behind the row of maple trees. The front door was still painted the pale blue I had chosen myself 3 summers earlier. The lavender pots on the porch were still there, a little dried out after a few days without water. The dark brown doormat was still crooked to one side, the way it always was. Everything was so intact it felt cruel, as if the house had never been told that the woman who lived there had already been declared dead on paper. Marcus rested a hand on the back of the front seat and turned toward me. You don't have to go inside if you change your mind. I shook my head. No, I need him to see me. We got out of the car. The late afternoon wind moved across the porch carrying the scent of damp earth and dry leaves. One federal agent stood behind me, while 2 others moved around the back. Marcus stepped ahead and unlocked the door with the same key I used to carry in my purse every day. The door opened slowly. I walked in behind him. The living room lights were on. Blake and Camille were sitting on the couch with a laptop open between them. On the coffee table were 2 glasses of water, a small notebook, and on the screen I could clearly see a travel booking website. Blake was leaning toward it, pointing at something on the screen, his mouth not yet closed from whatever he had just been saying when he looked up. I do not know whether the first thing that hit him was my face or my voice. Planning a new life, Blake? The entire room froze. Blake's face turned white right in front of me. Not the pale look of ordinary fear, but the drained, bloodless white of a man staring at something that should not exist. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Camille whipped around toward me, her eyes wide, and then a sharp scream tore out of her throat. I stepped 1 pace farther into the light in the middle of the living room. "You look disappointed," I said, my voice so calm it sounded strange even to me. "You were sure I was dead." Blake finally managed to speak. "No, that's impossible. Your name was on the manifest." I looked straight at him. "No, you just needed my name there." That sentence fell softly, but I saw it go through him like a blade. He stepped back a little, one hand reaching for the back of the couch, like a man whose balance had just been taken from him. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not throw at him the years I had given him, the breakfasts, the trust, the documents I had signed without reading. By then, my pain had passed the stage where it needed volume. It had become sharp, cold, and exact. "I thought about the wedding ring you left on the kitchen counter," I said. "About the bottle of pills you slipped into my bag like you were taking care of me. About the texts you sent, one after another, not because you were afraid something had happened to me, but because you were afraid I still hadn't boarded the plane." I paused, looked at Camille, then back at Blake. "About Tyler waiting in Las Vegas, about the hotel room, the pool, the bathtub, about the baby in her stomach, about the money you plan to use to buy yourself a new life with your wife's death." Camille wrapped an arm around her stomach by reflex, tears spilling over. "Blake," she said, as if even at that moment she still wanted him to think up some explanation gentle enough to save her from the truth. Blake shook his head over and over. "Savannah, listen to me. You don't understand all of it. It's not what you think." I looked at him for a long time. "No. It finally is exactly what I think. It's just too late now." He took another step back, this time toward the kitchen. The movement was small, quick, but enough for the people behind me to move too. I saw the intention in his eyes before he actually turned. Not to come closer to me, not to explain, just the instinct to run, from a man who had finally understood that the door he had opened toward a new life had slammed shut. "Blake Hayes!" Marcus shouted the exact second he spun around. At the same time, 2 federal agents came in through the back door. One blocked the kitchen entrance immediately, while the other moved straight into the middle of the living room. Blake stopped short, hands half raised, eyes darting between me, Marcus, and the doors now closed off on both ends. Marcus stepped forward, his voice cold and clear as metal. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and financial fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." Camille broke into sobs. "I didn't know everything," she said as she backed away, her voice shaking violently. "I swear I didn't know everything. I just... Marcus did not look at her. A female agent stepped toward Camille and instructed her to sit down. "We have audio recordings, communication logs, and transfer data, Miss Sutton. You'll have a chance to explain." Blake kept looking at me, as if by staring long enough he could make me disappear all over again. There was no love left in his eyes then, no performance, not even the composure he had worn like a suit for so many years. There was only the emptiness of a man forced at last to stand face to face with the consequences he had tried to package so neatly. I stood there in the house that had once been the safest place in my life, watched him being handcuffed, and realized there was no victory inside me. I did not feel like I was taking revenge. I only felt like a woman finally being seen by the man who had tried to erase her from the world. The days after that did not unfold like a movie. There was no rush of triumph, no instant relief the moment the cuffs closed around Blake's wrists. Everything dragged on through cold rooms, statements, questions repeated in level voices, and an exhaustion so deep that there were moments I could no longer tell whether I was answering because I wanted the truth on record, or simply because I no longer had the strength to keep carrying it inside me. Blake stayed silent for almost the first 2 days. He sat in the interrogation room with a gray face and dark circles hollowing his eyes, as if looking exhausted enough might somehow make everything less monstrous. But then Tyler Cross was arrested in Las Vegas. He confirmed what investigators had already begun to piece together. The plan was to get me alone at the resort, render me vulnerable, and make whatever happened next look accidental. Camille did not hold up for long either. She cried, denied what she could, and eventually had to admit that after learning I was believed dead, she had still sat with Blake and discussed withdrawing money, moving accounts, and leaving the country before too many questions could start. Once the links in the chain began tightening around him, Blake understood the performance was over. Marcus later told me that during the final interrogation, Blake no longer tried to act like a husband driven to the edge. He just sat there with his head bowed, staring at his hands for a very long time, before saying in a voice that was almost empty that he had lost nearly all the money I had entrusted to him. Failed investments piled on top of debt, fear of divorce piled on top of greed, and somewhere along that road he had decided the easiest way to keep everything was not to save the marriage, but to make me disappear. When Marcus asked what the first thing he felt was when he saw the news of the plane crash, Blake stayed silent for a long time before answering, "Relief." Just one word. But it was enough to make me understand everything I had kept trying not to understand. The trial took place months later. I testified on a gray morning, my hands cold even though the courtroom was warm. I told them what I had believed, what I had overlooked, and the moment I saw my own name on a list of the dead, while I was still sitting there, breathing in an airport security room. Officer Dana Keller sat not far from me. When she took the stand, she described in a steady voice the instinct that had made her stay near that checkpoint that morning, the way Blake had lingered too long, watched too closely, and said things no husband should be saying while seeing his wife off on a trip. Marcus laid out the full timeline of the conspiracy in a voice so clear and almost emotionless that the electronic records, the audio recordings, and the bank transfers spoke the rest for themselves. I did not need to look at Blake much. By then, the truth was far bigger than his face. The sentence was read in dry, heavy language. Conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, forgery, financial fraud conspiracy. Camille received a lighter sentence, but she did not escape responsibility. As for me, when I heard the judge read out the years Blake would spend paying for what he had done, I did not feel victorious. I only felt a sad, quiet stillness settle into my chest. My name was no longer on the list of the dead. And for the first time in years, my life no longer belonged in someone else's hands. Healing came slower than justice. I went to therapy. I learned how to call things by their real names, the signs I had once excused with the word love. There were sessions where I only sat there in silence because I realized the deepest wound was not that Blake wanted me dead, but that I had once mistaken control for support. I began writing. At first they were only short lines in a notebook, then chapters, then pieces of memory I was telling for the first time in my own voice. And out of those pages, I eventually started a small foundation to help other women understand that money can also be a form of imprisonment, and that dependence sometimes begins with the gestures that seem the gentlest. A year later, I went back to the airport. Not to fly. Only to stand in front of the checkpoint where my life had once turned in another direction. Dana stood there in the same familiar uniform, her hair still in the same neat bun as the first day I met her. I looked at her and said very softly, "You didn't just stop me from boarding a plane, you stopped me from disappearing." And that may be the deepest truth left after everything. My husband once believed the perfect crime was putting me on that flight. What he never expected was that the very thing he had taught me to silence for years, the real fear rising inside me, would be the thing that finally saved my life. Maybe what stays the longest after everything is not fear, but gratitude that I was given the chance to begin again. Some wounds never disappear completely, but in time we learn to live more gently with ourselves and to trust the voice inside us more than we did before. If this story stayed with you, I'd love for you to stay with me too by subscribing. And if you feel like sharing, tell me where you're listening from, or whether your intuition has ever saved you from something life-changing.